An old man, a quiet bench, a bag full of history. What happened one morning in Lantern Square looked ordinary until a young officer tried to assert power over the wrong person. But he wasn't alone. And what unfolded next would shake an entire city. Stay with us. You'll want to see this. It began, as these things often do, with something deceptively simple. A bench, a breeze, and a man so still he could have been mistaken for part of the landscape. The early light in Lantern Square, Montgomery's oldest public plaza, was soft that morning, slipping through the branches of century-old magnolias, scattering golden flecks across worn red brick and polished bronze plaques. The square wasn't grand, it wasn't loud, but it held stories. It held ghosts, and every morning at precisely 7 o'clock, Jeremiah Cole came to sit among them. 83 years old, retired educator, civil rights archivist, historian, and as some whispered in reverence, a walking library of the South. He wasn't famous in the way modern culture defines fame, no blue check, no bestseller, no podcast, but for those who knew, those who remembered. He was a cornerstone, a witness, a keeper of truth. He arrived the way he always did, without fanfare or fuss. Stepping carefully from his old Lincoln, with the same leather satchel slung over his shoulder and the same steel-handled cane tapping gently against the cobblestones. His movements were slow but deliberate, not weakened by age, but honed by discipline. Jeremiah Cole did nothing in haste. Not anymore. Not after all he'd seen. That morning, like so many before. He settled onto his bench, the third one in from the east gate, the one with the little plaque that read, "Dedicated to those who sat in silence," so others could stand in freedom. The plaque wasn't about him, but then again, in a quiet way. It always had been. He unscrewed the lid of his battered thermos, pouring steaming black coffee into the cap. No cream, no sugar, just strong and bitter. Like the mornings of his youth on the march from Selma. His journal, bound in cracked mahogany leather, rested on his lap. Inside it were names, stories, dates, memories too fragile to trust to digitization, too sacred to leave behind. He flipped it open to a fresh page. The corner of his lips turned up slightly as he read over an unfinished sentence from the day before. Truth does not tremble. It only waits. To most passers-by. Jeremiah Cole was invisible. An old black man with a notebook. Sitting still, sipping coffee, taking up space. A jogger with wireless earbuds didn't notice him. A nanny pushing a stroller gave him a polite, absent nod. A pair of tourists paused near the fountain, arguing about which way led to the Rosa Parks Museum. Life moved. The square hummed with the soft rhythm of routine, and Jeremiah remained still, letting it all pass by like water around a rock. But he wasn't idle. Every morning, Jeremiah took in the city like it was a living archive. He noticed the subtle changes a new flyer posted to the community board. A loose brick someone ought to fix. The shifting weight of history as it pressed and pulsed beneath the surface of everyday life. He'd seen Montgomery change, had helped change it. In fact, though, you wouldn't find his name in many textbooks. Too radical, they'd said. Too insistent. Too stubborn in the face of polite progress. He smiled to himself as he took another sip. The coffee had cooled slightly. He didn't mind. Across the square. The courthouse clock struck 7:15. The chime echoed gently through the trees. Birds fluttered overhead, somewhere behind him. The rattle of a city bus pulled up to the curb. Jeremiah let his mind wander. He thought of his wife, gone 7 years now, of the narrow kitchen where she used to hum as she cooked, of the letters he still wrote to her in that journal, even though he never mailed them. He thought of his students, thousands over the decades, some who had gone on to become lawyers, teachers, organizers. One had made it to Congress. Another now ran a library in Mobile. And he thought, as he always did, of that boy, the one who didn't make it back from Birmingham, just 14, just a child, gone in a flash of fire and rubble and smoke. Jeremiah could still see his eyes, still hear his voice calling Mr. Cole. "You really think we'll change the world?" Jeremiah had answered yes, and some days he still believed it. He rubbed the rim of the journal with his thumb, as if to steady himself. The world had changed, but it hadn't, and he had grown older waiting for the difference to settle into something solid, something undeniable. He had always known that progress, real progress, was not linear, it was cyclical, messy, prone to relapse. That's why he came to this bench, to remind himself that presence, unapologetic, unmovable presence was still a kind of protest, that in a world trained to look past men like him, refusing to disappear was its own kind of resistance. He closed his eyes briefly, letting the breeze kiss his cheeks. Then he heard it. Footsteps. Too heavy. Too fast. Not a jogger. Not casual. Authority in the rhythm. Swagger in the weight. Jeremiah opened his eyes, turned his head slightly. A young white officer in a crisp blue uniform was walking toward him. Square jaw, short sleeves, hand resting near his belt, not on his weapon. Not yet, but near enough. Jeremiah recognized the energy before he saw the man clearly. He had felt it in '63, on the bridge, in '68, outside the Memphis motel, in '71, when they raided the office and took his papers. It wasn't fear he felt now. It was memory, muscle deep, spirit deep, an ancestral ache. He looked back down at his journal, didn't even flinch. Just one more page in a long, long story. And thus began the morning at Lantern Square, not with a headline, not with a megaphone, not with fury or fire, but with a quiet sip of coffee and an old man refusing to move. A moment so small, so ordinary, that no one noticed it was history. Not yet, but they would. Officer Brendan Knox had been on the force for just under 11 months. But if you asked him, he'd tell you he was already seasoned, 27 years old, fresh out of the academy, and full of adrenaline-fueled purpose. Brendan had come to Montgomery with a chip on his shoulder and something to prove. Not that he'd ever admit that out loud. Not to his sergeant, not to his father, not even to himself. But it was there braided into every step of his boot, clenched tight in his jaw, and flaring behind his eyes whenever he scanned the streets for what he called suspicious activity. That morning, Brendan had been assigned to the Lantern Square beat, a quiet area that most of the senior officers liked to avoid for being, as one put it, too sleepy to count. But Brendan didn't see it that way. He saw every beat as a battleground and every patrol as a chance to assert control, to make his mark. He wasn't going to fade into the background like the other rookies. No, he was going to be the one who cracked down, who showed initiative, who kept order. That's what he told himself when he glanced in the mirror before leaving his apartment that morning, tightening the Velcro on his vest with mechanical precision. And so, when he rounded the edge of Lantern Square at just past 7:30, hands on his belt, posture stiff, heart just a little too fast for such a quiet stretch of town. It didn't take long for his eyes to settle on Jeremiah Cole. Old, black, sitting still, not doing anything. And somehow, that was enough. Brendan didn't know who the man was. Didn't care to. He just saw what he was conditioned to see, someone who didn't fit the mold of belonging in a space Brendan had already decided he owned. He saw the satchel, the thermos, the leather-bound book resting on Jeremiah's knees. And something in him twitched. It wasn't quite suspicion. It was something worse, assumption. Because Brendan Knox had been trained in a culture where gut instinct meant profile quickly, act fast, and apologize later if you must. Where showing deference was a sign of weakness, where power wasn't just something you carried, it was something you exercised, visibly and often. And in that culture, a black man sitting quietly on a bench with no obvious destination was not seen as benign. He was a question mark, an opportunity. Brendan circled the square once, pretending to check perimeters, eyes flicking casually across flower beds and trash cans, but always returning to that bench, to Jeremiah, to the stillness that unnerved him more than any outburst ever could. There was no noise, no crime, no urgency, just presence. And that was the problem. The truth was, Brendan hadn't made a single arrest in 3 days, and the captain had pulled him aside just yesterday and said, "We need more proactivity out there. Show you are not just walking a beat. Be visible. Be assertive." He had nodded, jaw tight. "Yes, sir. Will do. Sir." But the words sat heavy. Because Brendan's identity had always been built on doing, on intervening, correcting, controlling. He needed to do something to prove he belonged here. And Jeremiah, sitting so still, so calm, so unbothered by Brendan's presence, he became the something. Brendan's hand drifted to his radio, thumb grazing the button. "Dispatch," he said, voice low, casual. "Got a potential loiterer in Lantern Square, elderly male, unknown intent. Gonna make contact. No backup needed." He clicked off the mic and adjusted his duty belt like a gunslinger prepping for a draw. He wasn't nervous. He'd rehearsed this kind of interaction in training drills dozens of times. But the difference was, those drills never accounted for dignity, for history, for an old man with a spine built from marches and memories and things Brendan couldn't begin to understand. He approached. Jeremiah didn't look up at first, flipping a page in his journal with steady fingers. Brendan's boots crunched faintly on the gravel path. The park birds chirped indifferently. The world held its breath, though Brendan didn't notice. "Morning," he said flatly. Jeremiah nodded once. "Morning, officer." Brendan didn't smile. He didn't soften. He stood a little too long, letting silence turn awkward. "Can I ask what you're doing here?" Jeremiah lifted his eyes, then, calm, steady, unafraid, drinking coffee, reading, enjoying the morning. That a problem, Brendan felt his authority flicker. Just slightly. "Do you live around here?" "I do." "You got ID to prove that Jeremiah didn't move. Under Georgia law, I'm not required to show ID unless I'm suspected of a crime." "Are you accusing me of something?" The calm, the control. Brendan's stomach tightened. "You're fitting the description of someone we got complaints about." He lied. Jeremiah's brow lifted. "Elderly black man, reading on a bench. Must be an epidemic." The sarcasm stung. Brendan wasn't used to being talked back to, especially not by someone old enough to be his grandfather. His hand drifted near his holster. Not to draw, just to remind. The performance had begun. "I'm going to have to ask you to stand up," Brendan said, his voice sharpening. "So I can search that bag." Jeremiah leaned back slightly, almost amused. "No, you're not." A pause. "You refusing to cooperate? I'm refusing to be harassed." A squirrel darted across the path. The wind shifted. Somewhere a jogger slowed, sensing tension. Brendan's heartbeat began to tap harder in his ears. He had expected this to go differently. A quick check. Compliance. Another tick in his daily report. But now, standing in front of this man who wasn't afraid, who didn't shrink. Brendan felt something scrape against his pride. It wasn't about procedure anymore. It was personal. He reached out to take Jeremiah's arm. And that's when Jeremiah moved. Not to resist, not to fight, but to stand taller than Brendan expected, steadier than made sense. And then, with a voice soft as twilight and sharp as judgment, he said 6 words that made Brendan blink. "You don't know who I am." And in truth, Brendan didn't. He didn't know that this was the man who'd stood beside Dr. King in 1965, who had spoken to governors, buried friends, and survived nights when crosses burned outside his window. He didn't know that his satchel carried not weapons, but history, handwritten letters from icons Brendan had skimmed past in textbooks, but across the square. Someone else did. Talia Monroe, civil rights attorney on leave, had watched the whole thing from her bench. She didn't move yet. Not yet. But her fingers were already wrapped around her phone, the camera rolling, the badge tucked in her jacket like thunder waiting to strike. And Brendan Knox. He had just lit the match. Without realizing, he was no longer the hunter. He was the story. The moment Officer Brendan Knox placed his hand on Jeremiah Cole's arm, the morning cracked open not with noise, but with stillness too sharp to ignore. The early calm of Lantern Square thinned into a new kind of silence, the kind that hums just before a storm, where every sound, the rustle of leaves, the scrape of gravel, the distant bark of a dog feels louder than it should. But Brendan didn't notice, not yet. He was too caught up in the illusion of control, too swept up in the momentum of his authority, and too young to understand the gravity of what he had just touched. "I'm asking you again." "Sir," Brendan said, his voice rising with artificial calm, each word pressed down with emphasis. "Do you have identification on you or not?" Jeremiah remained seated, one hand resting gently on the handle of his cane, the other holding the edge of his leather-bound journal. He didn't blink, didn't flinch, just looked up at the officer with eyes that had seen more than Brendan could ever imagine. "I told you," Jeremiah said, voice steady as stone, "under Georgia law, unless I'm suspected of a crime, I'm not required to show you anything. And sitting here, drinking my coffee, reading a book, that's not a crime." Brendan's jaw clenched. He hated the tone reasonable, articulate, and above all, unmoved. He felt himself losing grip on the moment, not because Jeremiah was hostile, but because he wasn't. And Brendan had been trained for defiance, not for dignity. "I'm going to need you to stand up now," he said, louder, trying to seize control through volume. "And hand me that bag." Jeremiah didn't move. "Is there a reason you're demanding to search my bag?" "Officer, you're acting suspicious," Brendan snapped. "This is a public safety matter." Jeremiah glanced down at the satchel beside him, old, weathered, its seams frayed from decades of use, then back up at the officer. "Suspicious," he said softly, as though tasting the word. Because I'm sitting here, peacefully. With a thermos and a notebook, Brendan's hand hovered near his belt again. The bluff was becoming a habit. You can make this easy or difficult. Sir. But Jeremiah didn't move. Instead, he leaned forward ever so slightly, letting his voice drop just enough to land like a hammer on velvet. You have no idea whose story you're interrupting. It was a sentence Brendan had never heard before, and he didn't know how to respond. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't an excuse. But something about it shifted the air. "Excuse me?" Brendan asked, confused, defensive. Jeremiah stood then, slowly, deliberately, and it startled Brendan not because the movement was fast or aggressive, but because of the certainty behind it. The kind of certainty that comes only from someone who's had to defend their existence more times than he can count. "You want to know what's in this bag?" Jeremiah asked, gesturing toward the satchel. "You really want to reach inside it and drag out what you think you'll find?" Brendan didn't answer. He had one hand near his radio, the other inching toward the bag. Jeremiah didn't raise his voice. He didn't move to stop him. He simply said, "Inside that bag are letters from Rosa Parks, handwritten notes from John Lewis, photos from marches you've never heard of, and testimonies from people who died so men in uniform couldn't do what you're doing right now." A jogger slowed. A couple pushing a stroller stopped talking mid-sentence. The square. Moments earlier, a sleepy scene was now thick with attention. People didn't know the full story yet, but they knew enough. Something wasn't right. Jeremiah continued, "You think you're dealing with a vagrant, an old man wasting time. But I've given my time to this country, to this city, to this very square. I helped document the desegregation of Alabama's public schools. I was part of the team that uncovered the redlining maps still buried in your city archives. And I'm the reason this bench even exists." Brendan took a step back, but it wasn't voluntary. His body moved before his brain did, as though some deep part of him recognized the shift in power. Jeremiah straightened his spine. "You came here expecting silence, obedience, but what you've got is memory. And memory doesn't scare easy." Still, Brendan tried. "I don't care who you are," he muttered, unsure of whether he believed it anymore. But the crowd heard it. They heard his defiance and felt his uncertainty. And from just behind the shade of a pecan tree, Talia Monroe stood up. She didn't yell. She didn't stride over. She lifted her phone slightly higher. The camera had been rolling for 6 full minutes. Jeremiah saw her just a flick of his eye and gave a subtle nod. "You're not just violating my rights." "Officer," he said, returning his gaze to Brendan, "you're desecrating a legacy. You're disrespecting everyone who ever bled for this patch of land you're standing on." "I'm following procedure," Brendan shot back, but his voice lacked the conviction it held earlier. "No," Jeremiah replied, calmly. "You're following fear, and you're leading with ignorance." Brendan's hand twitched near the satchel, and again. Jeremiah stopped him, not with force, but with truth. "You don't get to touch this," he said. "Not without a warrant. Not without cause. Not while I still have breath." It wasn't bravado. It was testimony, the kind that echoes long after the moment ends. And finally, from the edge of the square, Talia Monroe's voice rang out, measured, crisp. "Officer, you need to step away from him. Right now." Brendan turned, startled. "Ma'am, this is a police matter." Talia didn't budge. She reached into her jacket and pulled out a leather wallet. It snapped open with practiced grace. Talia Monroe, Department of Justice, Civil Rights Division. That man is not alone. Brendan blinked. Jeremiah exhaled, and the square shifted again. What began as routine had become confrontation. What Brendan thought was control had become exposure. And what Jeremiah refused to surrender was never just a bag, or a seat, or a morning's peace. It was history, standing tall, unmoved, and unafraid. Talia Monroe had not planned to be in Lantern Square that morning. In fact, she had very deliberately chosen the plaza for its stillness, its quiet pathways, rustling trees, and the peaceful hush that always seemed to settle between the wrought iron fences and cobbled brick. After more than a decade as a federal civil rights attorney, most recently stationed in Atlanta, she was on her first official leave in 5 years. Not medical, not forced, just tired. She had spent the past few weeks house-sitting for her aunt in Montgomery, trying to remember what her life felt like when it wasn't dominated by legal briefs, subpoenas, or deposition rooms filled with men who never expected her to be in the room, let alone in charge of it. But even away from the desk, her mind never fully clocked out. She saw injustice the way a doctor hears irregular heartbeats instinctively, unavoidably, often before anyone else noticed. And that morning, she brought nothing but a book of Baldwin essays, a paper cup of coffee, and a faint hope that she might go one day, just one, without the familiar ache that justice was always 5 steps behind reality. She sat near the old stone fountain, in the second curve of the square's north quadrant, beneath a wide pecan tree whose leaves whispered low against the wind. It was a little after 7:30, and the sun was rising slow, spilling honey-colored light across the brickwork. She had read 2 paragraphs when she heard the first sharp note, in a voice she recognized too well. "Can I ask what you're doing here?" She didn't look up at first. The question was common enough, spoken every day in public spaces to people who looked like her, but the edge in the tone flat, clipped, rehearsed, made her spine stiffen. She lowered the book slightly, her eyes flicking toward the southeast corner of the square. That's when she saw them. The officer, white, tall, early 20s, rigid in posture, loomed over a seated older man, whose posture did not flinch or fold. Talia recognized something in the way the elder didn't even rise to meet him. Not fear, not defiance, something older, something heavier. She didn't know his name, not yet, but she knew exactly what kind of interaction this was becoming. She set her book down without a sound and shifted her coffee to her left hand. With her right, she reached into the inside pocket of her navy windbreaker, pulled out her phone, and began recording. No fuss, no dramatic moves, just a smooth, practiced gesture she had performed too many times in too many towns that claimed this doesn't happen here. The camera lens focused just as the officer demanded the man stand up, just as he gestured toward the bag resting at his side, just as the man dignified, composed, clearly older than the trees that framed the square, refused. Quietly, lawfully, Talia didn't know yet that she was witnessing a living archive of the civil rights movement being reduced to a suspicious person by a boy in a uniform. But her body knew before her mind caught up, because she had been the girl stopped outside a department store at 17. The college student asked to show ID while reading under a tree. The young lawyer told by a courtroom bailiff that the defense table is over there. "Miss?" Her instincts sharpened fast. She could see the shift in the officer's stance, the way he squared his shoulders as the man refused to comply, the way his hand hovered near his utility belt. He was escalating, and he didn't even realize it. Talia's breath slowed, a deliberate move honed by courtroom pressure. Stay steady. Stay present. Her phone's recording light blinked silently. The angle was wide enough to capture both faces. Her coffee sat cooling on the bench beside her. Forgotten. She knew the law. She could quote it in her sleep. Terry v. Ohio, Brown v. Mississippi, Knowles v. Iowa. She knew what constituted probable cause, what didn't. And she knew that suspicion based on someone sitting quietly on a bench didn't even come close. The officer had no warrant, no call, no visible threat. She saw him reach toward the satchel, and she stood up, not abruptly, not to draw attention, but with the kind of calm motion that spoke of control. She stepped forward slightly, just enough to shift her angle, just enough to be seen. She didn't speak yet. She didn't need to. Her camera saw everything. That's when she heard the older man speak. You don't know whose story you're interrupting. It hit her like a bell rung in the marrow. She paused, the words unfolding in her mind with unbearable familiarity. She was staring at a man who had already paid his dues to history, whose right to sit on a public bench should have been as sacred as the flag these officers swore to protect. She felt her heart climb into her throat as he described what lay in his bag: letters from Rosa Parks, notes from John Lewis, photographs from marches Brendan Knox would never understand. Talia's hand tightened on the phone. She had come to Lantern Square for rest, for silence. Instead, she was being called again to bear witness. The power dynamic was beginning to tip. The bystanders were no longer drifting past. They were watching, recording. A young couple across the path had stopped. A man on a bicycle looped back around. Even the birds seemed to still. And that's when Talia knew it was time. She stepped forward, letting her voice rise just enough to cut through the moment. "Officer, you need to step away from him. Right now." Knox turned, startled by the sudden interruption, his grip loosening from the older man's arm. "Ma'am, this is a police matter." Talia opened her jacket with slow, deliberate movement, revealing her leather credential wallet. She flipped it open to the badge. Talia Monroe, Department of Justice, Civil Rights Division. That man is not alone. Silence thundered through the square. The officer blinked, twice. His mouth opened slightly, words caught in the back of his throat. Talia didn't need him to speak. She needed him to listen. "You're not just approaching a citizen without cause," she said. "You're violating civil rights in broad daylight, and I've got it all on camera." Her voice wasn't angry. It didn't need to be. It was the kind of voice trained to indict corruption with sentences wrapped in legal steel. And in that moment, Brendan Knox finally realized he had misread the entire story. Because the man in front of him was not just an old man on a bench, and the woman stepping forward was not just a concerned bystander. This was not his square. This was history, and it had come alive. There was a moment brief, breathless, where time seemed to hesitate. Lantern Square, once humming softly with the rhythms of morning, stood utterly still. Not a stroller rolled, not a jogger thudded past, not a pigeon cooed beneath the oaks. All eyes were on the old man with the cane and the leather satchel, standing face to face with a young officer whose authority had just been cracked open by a calm voice and a federal badge. And in that stillness, Jeremiah Cole did something remarkable. He told the truth, not just a truth about the moment, but a truth about history, buried just beneath the surface. Held in the worn seams of a bag, the officer had almost dared to unzip. "You want to know what's in this satchel?" Jeremiah said, his voice even, eyes locked on Officer Brendan Knox, with the weight of someone who had been tested before. "You think you've found something suspicious here? Something dangerous? Something you can control." The officer stiffened. His eyes flicked from the bag to Jeremiah's face, then back again. But Jeremiah didn't give him space to speak. He didn't allow interruption. He simply lifted his hand, rested it gently on the satchel, like a father shielding a child, and continued. "This bag holds over 60 years of memory," he said. "Inside, you'll find a letter handwritten by Rosa Parks, given to me the year before she died. You'll find original photographs from the Montgomery bus boycott, not the ones that made the papers, but the ones people hid in their shoes when the police raided their homes. You'll find transcripts of speeches never delivered, because the men who wrote them didn't live long enough." He paused, letting each word land like footsteps on sacred ground. "You'll find my own journal's entries written after I walked across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, bled on the asphalt, stitched myself up because the clinic turned me away. You'll find receipts from the marches, arrest records from 1963, letters I wrote to Dr. King that never got mailed because I was too young to believe he'd ever write back." By now, the crowd had thickened. Locals, tourists, teenagers clutching iced coffees, a mother with a baby slung across her chest, phones raised, eyes wide. The entire square seemed to pulse with a collective understanding that they weren't witnessing a disturbance, they were witnessing a reckoning. "And you, Officer Knox," Jeremiah continued, his tone sharpening but never rising. "You think this is just another morning, another report to file. But what you nearly touched without consent, without cause, is not yours to claim. This bag is our history, Black history, American history, and I won't let you violate it." Brendan swallowed hard. His hand, which had hovered near the strap of the bag just moments ago, now hung uselessly at his side. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The confidence that once coiled around his badge had thinned into uncertainty. Jeremiah took one step forward, his cane tapping the bricks with a crisp sound that echoed louder than a shout. "I assert my rights under the Fourth Amendment of the Constitution of these United States," he said. "I am not under arrest. You have no reasonable suspicion. You have no warrant. I am not compelled to consent to any search or seizure of my personal property." The words clean, legal, devastating hit like thunder. And Brendan had no reply. Because he didn't know the precedent. He didn't know the names. He didn't know the weight of the document he'd almost manhandled. He didn't know the voices that lived in Jeremiah's satchel. He didn't even know who he was standing in front of. But the crowd did. A man near the fountain whispered, "That's him. That's Jeremiah Cole." A woman near the path nodded. "I saw him speak at a freedom school in Selma. He taught my brother." A high school senior quietly mouthed the word legend as she pulled up a Wikipedia page on her phone and began reading aloud to the friend beside her. Talia Monroe, still holding her phone steady as it streamed the scene live to hundreds and quickly thousands of viewers, said nothing. She didn't need to. The truth was already unfolding, and she knew the law would have its moment. But this was something bigger than legal argument. This was memory come alive. This was legacy defended. Not with fists, but with words that carried the weight of generations. Brendan looked to his radio like it might save him. But the crowd was too thick now, the scrutiny too sharp. His authority was no longer assumed, it was being evaluated. Jeremiah turned slightly, his gaze sweeping the people gathered. He saw them, all of them. The girl holding her father's hand, the man wearing a vintage campaign pin, the elderly couple wiping tears from behind their glasses. "I don't raise my voice," he said, "to no one in particular. I raise my presence. That's how I've survived." A ripple of quiet agreement moved through the square. Jeremiah turned back to Brendan, who now looked far smaller than his uniform allowed. "Son," Jeremiah said, voice gentler now, "I've buried men who died for the right to sit where they pleased. Don't think for a second I'll be bullied into forgetting that." Brendan finally spoke. "I didn't know." "I know you didn't," Jeremiah replied. "That's the problem." The tension was no longer between man and officer, it was between ignorance and history, between badge and lived experience. And Jeremiah wasn't moving, not for noise, not for fear, not for a uniform that couldn't recognize what it stood in front of. And, above it all, the satchel remained untouched. It wasn't just leather and stitching. It was a vessel, a relic, a burden carried not just for him, but for every name he ever wrote down, every friend he'd ever lost, every truth denied, but never erased. Jeremiah reached down slowly and ran his fingers along the spine of his journal. "This book contains pain," he said softly, almost to himself. "But it also contains power. And you almost treated it like contraband." Brendan took one small step back. The crowd took one unified breath. And the morning, once peaceful, had become history in real time. What began as a search for control had become a confrontation with truth. And Jeremiah Cole, still standing, still unbowed, had revealed a legacy that no one could ever again overlook. Talia Monroe stepped forward, not with haste, not with anger, but with the measured resolve of someone who had walked through enough fire to know that the calmest voice in the room often carried the sharpest blade. Her heels clicked softly against the bricks of Lantern Square as she crossed the final steps between her bench and the confrontation unraveling before the crowd. She had watched long enough. Jeremiah Cole had held the line with grace. But the line had now turned into a battlefield, and the law, her law, was ready to be enforced. Brendan Knox turned to her with wide, startled eyes, the telltale signs of panic blooming beneath the brim of his hat. Up until this moment, he thought he was managing the situation. But something about the way this woman moved, the purposeful stillness, the invisible gravity told him the situation was now managing him. "I said," Talia repeated, her voice neither raised nor rushed, but chiseled from steel. "Step away from Mr. Cole, immediately." Brendan bristled on instinct. "Ma'am, this is a police matter. I'm conducting an investigation of—" "You're conducting a constitutional violation," she interrupted, her tone razor-sharp. "And I strongly suggest you stop talking before you say something else that compromises your department further." She reached inside her jacket and withdrew her badge wallet. It opened with a satisfying snap, the sun catching the gold seal of the United States Department of Justice. Talia Monroe, Civil Rights Division, DOJ. The crowd murmured. Phones shifted angles. Brendan froze, his entire frame suddenly too stiff, too visible. For the first time, he looked genuinely unsure of where to stand. "Let me be absolutely clear," Talia continued, now addressing not just Brendan but the square itself. Her voice had the practiced cadence of courtroom authority, slow, deliberate, undeniable. "What I just witnessed was an attempted unlawful search and seizure of personal property, targeted profiling of a black citizen without probable cause, and an egregious abuse of power under color of law." Brendan took a half-step back, lips parting, but she didn't give him room to interrupt. "This man," she gestured to Jeremiah, was peacefully exercising his right to occupy public space. He was approached without justification. He was interrogated, threatened, and nearly subjected to an illegal search. The Fourth Amendment is not a suggestion. Officer Knox, it is a limit. One you have just trampled in front of a growing crowd and on multiple recording devices. The officer's face reddened, but his hands stayed at his sides. The badge on his chest, once a shield of confidence, now seemed to weigh more than he could bear. Jeremiah remained still beside her, his hands resting lightly on his cane. His eyes, though proud, were tired now, tired not from fear, but from the quiet heartbreak of watching history repeat its ugliest verses. The crowd, which had thickened to nearly 36 people, was silent. They weren't just watching. They were absorbing every word. And with each sentence, Talia spoke. The truth pulled tauter across the plaza like a drawn string, waiting to snap. "This is not 1961, she said, now scanning the faces in the crowd as she spoke. There are cameras. There is federal oversight. And more importantly, there are people witnesses, citizens who will no longer let these moments slip quietly into the cracks of silence." Her badge glinted in the sunlight. Brendan's jaw twitched. "You don't have to like me." "Officer," Talia said, voice suddenly softer, deadlier, "but you do have to respect the law, and the law does not stand on your side today." Brendan blinked. His shoulders slumped almost imperceptibly. But before he could answer, before he could try to recover even a shred of footing, the sound of approaching footsteps cracked through the moment like thunder. Two uniformed officers, both older, both clearly senior, turned the corner from the eastern walkway. One of them, Lieutenant Jared Lewis, wore a look that suggested he'd already been briefed by dispatch and didn't like what he was walking into. The other, Sergeant Elena Ruiz, moved with the grim speed of someone who suspected their department was about to make national headlines. Lewis took in the scene in seconds. The crowd, the raised phones, the Justice Department badge, the visibly shaken rookie. He locked eyes with Talia and gave the faintest nod, a silent acknowledgement that he knew exactly who she was and how bad this had become. "Officer Knox," Lewis said, loud enough for the crowd to hear. "Step back from Mr. Cole." Brendan didn't move. "That's an order," Ruiz added, already reaching for her radio. "You are being relieved, pending immediate review. I suggest you comply before this becomes more than departmental." Brendan finally took 3 steps back. The air seemed to release a long-held breath. Jeremiah, who had said nothing during the entire exchange, turned to Talia and offered a slow, grateful nod. "Thank you," he said. Talia shook her head. "You shouldn't have needed me," she replied, her voice low enough just for him. "But I'm damn glad I was here." Lieutenant Lewis stepped between Brendan and the crowd, ushering the younger officer to the edge of the square where another cruiser had just pulled up. Sergeant Ruiz approached Talia and began collecting a preliminary statement while making notes on her phone, already coordinating with internal affairs. The crowd didn't disperse. Not yet. They stayed, watching not with the frenzy of spectators, but with the reverence of witnesses. Something had shifted. The uniform no longer held uncontested authority. The badge did not guarantee silence. The rules had changed not because of noise, but because a black man refused to be erased, and a black woman refused to let the erasure go unchallenged. As Brendan Knox was escorted to the cruiser, Jeremiah turned back toward his bench. The satchel was still there, untouched, revered now, understood. He lowered himself back onto the bench slowly, carefully. Talia stood beside him. "I've been through worse," Jeremiah said, sipping what remained of his coffee. "I know," Talia replied, "but you shouldn't have to keep going through it." He looked up at her, a quiet pride in his eyes. "Maybe not," he said, "but I don't mind standing if it helps others sit a little longer in peace." She smiled at that, then turned as more officers began to secure the scene. History had been nearly trampled that morning, but in the end, it stood its ground. And this time, the law stood with it. It took less than 12 hours. By the time the sun had set behind the oaks of Lantern Square, Talia Monroe's video had already been shared over 400,000 times. By dawn, that number had tripled. It wasn't the first time a black elder had been harassed by a uniformed officer. It wasn't even the first time it had happened in that very city. But something about the footage, about Jeremiah Cole's quiet dignity, about the unmistakable voice of history wrapped in a leather satchel, about the calm, crushing authority with which Talia invoked federal law struck a nerve far deeper than the square where it had taken place. It began on social media. A clip under 3 minutes long, titled "He Survived Selma." They tried to search his bag. Within hours, hashtags like #RespectJeremiah, #Justice in Montgomery, and "Bench Not Badge" were trending across platforms. Celebrities, activists, and historians reposted it with commentary. Civil rights organizations issued statements of support. News outlets scrambled to find background on the man now being hailed as a living monument. But it wasn't just the internet that responded. It was the country. Within 24 hours, the Department of Justice convened an emergency panel to review the footage. Talia, who had been on personal leave, was summoned back to Washington for a high-level briefing. She arrived in the same blazer she'd worn in Lantern Square, the memory of Jeremiah's voice still echoing in her mind. "You don't know whose story you're interrupting." She knew now that the interruption was over, and the reckoning was just beginning. She expected to be sidelined, thanked politely, then passed over in favor of a higher-ranking male colleague. But the Attorney General didn't blink when he handed her the directive. "You started this," he said simply. "You're finishing it." She was reinstated within the hour. Lead investigator. Full authority. Her first move, open a formal investigation into the Montgomery Police Department's practices, starting with Officer Brendan Knox, but not ending there. Because as the videos circulated and the spotlight intensified, other stories began to emerge. Whispers grew into declarations. Silence gave way to testimony. A retired black officer came forward, revealing that he'd been repeatedly reassigned to desk duty after reporting a supervisor for racial slurs. A Latina dispatcher admitted she'd been instructed to flag certain 911 calls with coded language meant to justify heightened use of force in predominantly black neighborhoods. A white rookie, now stationed 2 towns over, submitted a written affidavit stating he had been pressured to falsify a report involving excessive force during his first month in Montgomery. Talia's team, flown in from Washington, set up operations in a borrowed municipal building just 3 blocks from City Hall. 10 agents, 2 civil rights attorneys, 1 forensic data analyst, and the full weight of the Civil Rights Division. They didn't arrive quietly. Their presence was surgical paper trails, body cam footage, internal memos, patrol maps, complaint logs. They combed through 10 years of departmental data. What they found confirmed what generations of residents had always known but could never quite prove: systemic racial targeting wasn't just tolerated. It had been engineered. There were spreadsheets assigning officers to proactive patrols in black neighborhoods, language wrapped in bureaucratic comfort, but laced with statistical violence. The patterns were undeniable disproportionate stops. Searches and arrests concentrated in zip codes that accounted for less than 20% of the city's population. Complaint files had been mysteriously misplaced. Body cam footage from certain high-profile incidents had malfunctioned or been overwritten. Officers with multiple excessive force allegations had been promoted instead of disciplined. One lieutenant, who had 5 unresolved complaints in 2 years, was found to have received a commendation for community engagement. And Brendan Knox. He was no rogue officer. His record showed that he had been encouraged, quietly but consistently, to use assertive presence tactics. The same language appeared in training manuals, quarterly reviews, and peer evaluations. It wasn't just misconduct, it was policy. When Talia confronted the department's internal affairs chief with the findings, he didn't argue. He just sat there, shoulders sagged, whispering. I tried. They didn't listen. They will now, she said. By the end of the second week, subpoenas had been issued. Federal oversight procedures were being drafted. And the mayor, once reluctant to challenge the police union, issued a public statement promising full cooperation. But none of it would have happened if not for that bench, that morning, that satchel, and Jeremiah. As news of the investigation spread, the public response in Montgomery evolved from outrage to mobilization. Community leaders held forums in school gymnasiums and churches. Former students of Jeremiah Cole, now teachers, organizers, librarians spoke at vigils held in the square. One teenager created a digital archive of the documents Jeremiah had safeguarded for decades. Donations poured in to fund a permanent exhibition. The city, once content to cover its wounds with civic slogans and heritage tours, was now forced to look in the mirror. And while many called for Brendan Knox's immediate termination, Jeremiah never once demanded retribution. In fact, when a local reporter asked him what justice looked like, his response was as measured as the morning he spoke at Justice. He said, "Is not in punishment, it's in prevention. I'm not here to watch them fall. I'm here to make sure others rise." And that, perhaps, was the greatest spark of all, because in the face of humiliation, Jeremiah had not chosen vengeance, he had chosen truth. In the face of systemic rot, Talia had not chosen silence. She had chosen accountability. And together, an elder with a cane and a satchel, and a lawyer with a badge and a phone, they had set fire to a lie that had long masqueraded as order. This wasn't just about one officer. It wasn't just about one department. This was the moment when a city remembered it had witnessed injustice and had the tools, at long last, to confront it. Talia looked out over the square one evening, just before sunset. The same bench, the same trees, the whispers of new conversations rippling through the city. The spark had caught, and the reckoning had begun. By the third week, Lantern Square was no longer just a park. It had transformed quietly at first, then unmistakably into a kind of sacred ground. The bench where Jeremiah Cole once sat in peace and was nearly stripped of his dignity had become more than a witness stand. It was a symbol, a wound, a starting point. And the people of Montgomery responded not with rage, but with remembrance and resolve. They did not just react, they organized. At first, it began with chalk messages. One early morning, before the dew had lifted from the grass, someone had written in looping script across the bricks, "Thank you, Mr. Cole." By noon, a dozen others appeared. "We see you. You belong here." History sat down and stood up again, Children traced the letters. Elders wept reading them. Tourists paused and pulled out their phones, not for spectacle, but reverence. By the end of that day, the mayor's office received over 3,000 emails demanding transparency and reform. By the next morning, the square was full. It began with a few dozen mostly college students from Alabama State University, clutching printed flyers and clipboards, offering passerby QR codes to join a petition for police reform. Then came the clergy, walking in quiet pairs, stoles draped over shoulders, holding candles in silence. Then came the grandmothers, slow but steady, seated on folding chairs brought from home, telling stories of when Jeremiah taught them history in a church basement during segregation. And then came the youth organizers, young black voices armed with data, dreams, and bullhorns not to shout for the sake of noise, but to lead. Talia Monroe stood among them in plain clothes, no badge visible. She didn't speak, she listened. And Jeremiah, he was there. Too, not at the center, never seeking it, but seated off to the side on a bench freshly scrubbed and adorned with lilies. He wore his pressed slacks, a navy hat with the words "Foot Soldier" embroidered in gold, and a small smile that flickered like a candle, equal parts humility and disbelief. He'd lived long enough to see marches rise and fade, promises made and broken. But this was different. This wasn't a performance. This was a reckoning with roots. The calls for change were not abstract. They were precise, pragmatic, pointed. Community leaders drafted a 5-point proposal submitted to City Hall within 10 days of the incident. It demanded 1. Full implementation of federal oversight in all patrol and arrest procedures. 2. A civilian community review board with subpoena power. 3. Mandatory racial bias retraining for all active duty officers. 4. Public access to body cam footage upon request. 5. Removal and replacement of leadership within internal affairs. It was not just a list of demands, it was a map. The mayor, whose silence early on had drawn criticism, was now cornered not by opposition, but by momentum. At a press conference held in the municipal rotunda, she stood beneath a portrait of Rosa Parks and admitted what so few in her position had the courage to say: "We failed to listen. We failed to look closely. We failed Mr. Cole, and by extension, we failed all those who came before him and all those coming after." The words did not erase the past, but they cracked open the door. What followed was nothing short of civic transformation. The City Council passed a resolution formally recognizing Lantern Square as a historical site. A proposal was approved to rename the Eastern Promenade Cole's Path, and a bronze plaque was installed beside the now iconic bench bearing an inscription that read, "Here." Dignity met disrespect. Dignity won. Training programs for law enforcement were overhauled. Officers were now required to attend quarterly workshops, led by local historians and civil rights educators, including one taught by Jeremiah himself. Body cam footage policies were rewritten. Disciplinary records, once sealed and buried, were digitized and made publicly searchable. More importantly, a new face took over as head of Internal Affairs, Detective Angela Bright, a veteran officer and Montgomery native with a long, unblemished record and the quiet respect of both the force and the community. She was the first black woman ever to hold the position, and perhaps most profound of all. The Community Oversight Board, formed just 2 months after Jeremiah's ordeal, held its first public meeting under the pavilion at Lantern Square. Over 200 residents attended, not to protest, but to participate. They spoke not in sound bites, but in lived experience. A middle school teacher shared how her 6th grade class had watched Talia's video together, then written essays on what it meant to be seen. A teenage boy stood up and said he'd never imagined a future in law until he saw a black woman stand down a cop in public and win. An elderly woman named Mavis, cane in hand, told the board, "I saw my brother in Mr. Cole. I saw my father, and I thank God I lived long enough to see the truth come to light." As for Jeremiah, he remained a steady presence, not leading marches or giving speeches, but showing up every morning at 7 o'clock. He still sat on that bench, sometimes with coffee, sometimes with nothing but sunlight and silence, but always with purpose. He said very little about the national attention, the interviews he declined, the documentaries he turned down. When asked why, he simply said, "The work isn't done just because people are looking. It's done when they stop needing to." But Talia understood. They all did. Because this wasn't about one man, one badge, or one bench anymore. It was about a city relearning itself, reclaiming the parts of its story that had been ignored, whitewashed, or buried in the folds of polite denial. Lantern Square was no longer just a square. It was a mirror. And in that mirror, Montgomery finally saw its reflection and decided to change it. Not with slogans, but with structures. Not with rage, but with reckoning. Not with a single voice, but with a community. Rising together, 6 months after that quiet morning in Lantern Square. The sun rose over Montgomery with a clarity that felt earned. The air had shifted since spring, less heavy, more honest. The city that once let silence settle over its sins now buzzed with a new kind of energy, remembrance fused with resolve. On this particular morning, a modest crowd had gathered just after 8 o'clock, pressed together beneath the broad limbs of the old oak trees, eyes drawn to the eastern end of the square, where something new stood, a sculpture, a bench, and a name etched into bronze. It was not a ceremony of grandeur, no parade, no confetti, but what it lacked in spectacle, it made up for in substance. Because this wasn't just a dedication, it was a reckoning made permanent, a public acknowledgement of a man who had not asked for cameras or applause, who had not shouted to be heard, but who had refused quietly, firmly to be moved. The bench was a perfect replica of the one Jeremiah Cole had sat on that fateful day. Same curve in the slats, same rusted bolts, now preserved in sculpture. But beside it stood the true centerpiece, a life-sized bronze figure, seated calmly, hands resting atop a cane, a closed journal in his lap, head tilted as if listening not for trouble, but for truth. The face was not an exact portrait. The artist, a young woman from Birmingham, had chosen to keep the features open enough to hold many stories, not just Jeremiah's, but everyone there knew who it was meant to honor. A hush fell over the crowd as the mayor stepped forward. Her voice wavered not from nerves, but from the weight of everything the city had faced in the past half-year. "Today," she said, "we don't just unveil a statue. We recognize a man whose stillness moved a nation. We acknowledge a failure of our systems and celebrate the courage that turned a moment of injustice into a movement of change." Applause followed, slow, steady, respectful. Then came Attorney General Nadia Belton, flown in from Washington that morning. She took the podium with the presence of someone who knew the difference between symbolism and substance. "I'm proud to announce," she began, "the creation of a new federal initiative inspired by what began here in Montgomery. It will focus on uncovering civil rights violations in overlooked municipalities, towns, and departments too small for headlines but big enough to hurt people. We're calling it the Cole Initiative. Gasps of approval, a few muffled tears, and scattered applause met her words. Reporters jotted notes. Advocates nodded in solemn agreement. The task force would be the first of its kind, targeted, proactive, and permanent, funded directly through the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division. It would deploy field agents, legal analysts, and community liaisons to investigate complaints and bring systemic reform to places long ignored. But it was not the mayor's words or the DOJ's announcement that people would remember most. It was Jeremiah Cole himself, standing slowly from a seat near the front, his weathered hand gripping the cane that had become as iconic as the story itself. At 83 years old, he moved carefully, but not weakly. The crowd stood as he approached the mic, some rising instinctively, some with reverence, all with attention. He didn't speak loudly. He didn't need to. "I didn't ask for this," he began, nodding gently toward the statue, the plaque, the cameras. "I didn't march all those years ago to end up made of metal." Laughter bubbled through the tension. "A gentle release. I didn't ask to be a symbol," he continued, more serious now. "I asked to be left in peace. I sat on that bench because I had earned that peace. And yet, if my peace lights a fire under justice, if my presence reminds people that silence is not the same as safety, then I'll sit here proudly, not as a statue, but as a man who never stopped believing that truth could still change things." A pause. He looked out over the crowd, the children on their parents' shoulders, the young organizers holding signs, the clergy, the city workers, the survivors of their own unspoken stories. "This isn't just for me," he said. "This is for the ones who never made it home, the ones who didn't have someone watching, the ones who were stopped, searched, silenced, and never saw a bench again. If this moment reminds even one of them that they mattered, that their story counts, then let this be more than bronze. Let it be a beacon." The applause rose again, deeper this time. More than appreciation, it was gratitude wrapped in grief, in hope, in recognition. Jeremiah stepped down from the podium as flashbulbs clicked and reporters whispered. But he didn't linger. He returned to the bench, not the sculpture, but the real one, just a few feet away, the very spot where it all began. He sat, crossing his legs slowly, lifting his satchel onto his lap. That morning, it held more than documents. It held a nation's attention. Again, Talia Monroe approached quietly and sat beside him. She didn't speak at first. She just let the moment settle, the way good lawyers do, making space for meaning to breathe. "They named the task force after you," she said eventually. Jeremiah chuckled softly. "I would have settled for an apology." "They gave you both," she replied. He nodded. "Not just to me, to all of us." They sat in silence for a while, watching people approach the statue, touch its hands, leave notes and flowers and small folded paper cranes. One little boy, no older than 10, reached out and traced the edge of the cane. His father knelt beside him and whispered something about strength and history. Talia turned to Jeremiah. "You changed the country." He shook his head. "We did," he said. "You showed up. I stayed seated. Sometimes, that's all it takes." The breeze stirred overhead. The oaks danced softly. Across the square, a musician began playing an old freedom song on a trumpet, slow and reverent. As the crowd dispersed and the city returned to its rhythm, the bronze figure remained, quiet, watching, waiting, not as a monument to a single man, but as a reminder that peace is a right, not a reward. And sometimes, when you hold your ground, the world shifts with you. What happened in Lantern Square wasn't just an isolated event, it was a mirror held up to our nation's conscience. When Jeremiah Cole, an 83-year-old civil rights archivist, sat quietly on a bench. He did what every American should be free to do, exist in public without suspicion. But when Officer Brendan Knox profiled him, tried to search his satchel, and violated his rights, it reminded us that the battle for justice is not behind us. It is still unfolding. Yet what followed gave us hope, because someone was watching. Talia Monroe, a federal civil rights attorney, stood up, spoke out, and brought the full weight of the law to bear, not just to protect one man, but to expose a pattern, a culture, a system. The DOJ didn't just investigate. They listened, and the people of Montgomery didn't just protest. They organized. They created change that will last longer than any headline. In just 6 months, a single moment of injustice led to new leadership, public accountability, and the creation of a nationwide task force. The Cole Initiative focused on protecting civil rights in small towns that often escape scrutiny. That's the lesson here. You don't need 1 million followers to spark change. Sometimes all it takes is one voice refusing to be silenced, one phone recording the truth, one community refusing to let the story die. So ask yourself, where is your Lantern Square? What benches are being watched in silence in your city? What stories aren't being told because no one is hitting record? If this story moved you, if it challenged you, if it reminded you that justice is still alive and still worth fighting for, don't let it end here. Hit that like button to show your support. Subscribe to the channel to hear more stories like this, stories that don't make the nightly news but do make a difference. And please share this video. Share it with someone who thinks their voice doesn't matter. Share it with a student, a teacher, a neighbor, a skeptic. Because when stories like Jeremiah Cole's are seen, remembered, and passed forward, they don't just educate, they ignite. This isn't about going viral, it's about going deeper. And together, we can keep justice alive, one voice, one share, one subscriber at a time.